Episode 3 The Mongols. Question 1. How does the Mongol conquest of Khwarazm illustrate their dual impulses of ferocity and pragmatism? Khwarazm was a major state in Central Asia, enriched by its advantageous location halfway along the Silk Roads. After his diplomatic mission seeking political and commercial relations was slaughtered, Mongol leader Genghis Khan demanded recompense from Muhammad Shah, ruler of Khwarazm. In an act of hubris, Muhammad Shah dismissed this demand. What followed was nothing less than the complete destruction of Khwarazm. The ferocity with which the Mongols assaulted the Khwarazmian state has become the stuff of legend. The infamous Mountains of Skulls comes to mind. The Mongol practice was to approach a city and demand its immediate surrender. If the residents refused, the Mongols would besiege the city, and when it inevitably fell, would slaughter its inhabitants. After his son-in-law was killed at the siege of Nishapur, Genghis Khan ordered the beheading of every man, woman, child, infant, cat, and dog. Significantly, however, the Mongols would typically spare the lives of skilled artisans. The Mongols always looked for new ways to improve their fighting ability, and embraced any new technologies that could facilitate that. Additionally, the Mongols liked money and were eager to maintain and strengthen trade networks that could monetize the product of a skilled artisan class. The Mongols were thus both ruthless and pragmatic. Their goal was not wanton slaughter, because a dead city cannot prosper, and though the scale of their retribution could be massive, they nonetheless embraced populations that were willing to bend the knee. The Mongols thus were instrumental in the spread of trade and technology and culture between East and West. Question 2. Why were the Mongol conquests so important? Think specifically about the quote-unquote world aspect of human history. Although the Mongols were fierce fighters, capable of terrible acts of retribution against those who dared defy them, their conquest brought with it much more than death and devastation. At the peak of their power, the domains of the Mongol Khans made up a vast realm in which once hostile peoples lived together in peace, and most religions were tolerated. From the Ilkhanate of Persia in the west to the empire of the fabled Kublai Khan in the east, the law code promulgated by Genghis Khan provided orderly arrangements for trade and other activities. Like the far less warlike Islamic expansion that preceded it, the Mongol explosion laid the foundations for human interaction on a global scale, extending and intensifying the world network that had been building since the classical age. Question 3. Why was all-conquering Mongol expansion not possible before Genghis Khan? In other words, what did he accomplish that made expansion possible? The Mongols were nomads in the truest sense of the word, wearing clothes and living in tents made from the skin and wool of the sheep and goats that constituted the economic backbone of Mongol society. The transitory nature of such a culture meant that unification of the various tribes did not come easily. Genghis Khan, known in his youth as Temujin, changed this. An adolescence during which he suffered the humiliating dismantling of the clan built by his father spurred Genghis Khan to single-mindedly pursue a path of both vengeance and supreme power. Though a skilled warrior and tactician, it was both Genghis Khan's aptitude for organization and his vision of empire that molded the Mongol tribes into a unified, all-conquering behemoth. Genghis Khan brought organization, discipline, and unity of command to the previously fractious clans. The old quarrels and vendettas between tribes were overridden by loyalty to the Khagan. Thus, energies once devoted to infighting were now directed towards conquest and the forcible extraction of tribute, both in areas controlled by other nomadic groups and in the civilized centers that fringed the Mongolian steppes on all sides. Question 4. What was the most important factor for Mongol military success? There were a number of direct and practical factors that contributed to Mongol military success. There was a special unit that supplied Mongol armies with excellent maps of the areas they were to invade. These maps were drawn according to the information supplied by Genghis Khan's extensive network of spies and informers. New weapons, including a variety of flaming and exploding arrows, gunpowder projectiles, and later bronze cannons, were also devised for the Mongol forces. Mongol armies even included a separate messenger force, whose bodies were tightly bandaged to allow them to remain in the saddle for days. The Mongols were famed cavalrymen and archers, and their preeminent mastery of each made them deadly on the battlefield. Ultimately, the Mongols' greatest strength was not a tangible asset, but rather a mindset. When the Mongols began to expand beyond the Mongolian steppes, they encountered new types of military challenges, such as fortified cities. The inhabitants of these cities dismissed the idea that a group of nomadic horsemen armed with bows could threaten powerful sedentary states. Indeed, the Mongol invaders were thwarted at first by the intricate defensive works that the Chinese had perfected over the centuries to deter nomadic incursions. But Genghis Khan's expansive vision meant that the Mongols were not content with pillaging the countryside around a walled city, then retreating back to their heartlands, as nomadic invaders had done in the past. Genghis Khan wanted to take entire states. With the help of captured Chinese artisans and military commanders, the invading forces devised a whole arsenal of siege weapons. These included battering rams, catapults that hurled rocks and exploding balls, and bamboo rockets that spread fire and fear in besieged cities. The Mongols did not let tradition define their military approach, and gladly employed any tactic that would give them a fighting edge. Their single-minded pursuit of victory engendered a flexibility and willingness to adapt that would be the true strength of the Mongols. Question 5. Who was Prester John, and how does he factor into the Mongol story? What does this illustrate about the worldview of Europeans at this time? Prester John was a mythical figure, a rich and powerful Christian monarch whose kingdom had supposedly been cut off from Europe by the Muslim conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries. Sometimes located in Africa, sometimes in Central Asia, Prester John loomed large in the European imagination as a potential ally who could strike the Muslim enemy from the rear and join up with the European Christians to destroy their common adversary. When word of a relentlessly unstoppable military force advancing from the east reached European ears, it was seen as the return of Prester John. The Mongol assault on the Muslim Khwarazmian Empire appeared to confirm the speculation that Genghis Khan was in fact Prester John. At first glance, this rather absurd outlook can easily be dismissed as fanciful wishful thinking, but it does reveal much about the mindset and worldview of Europeans at the time. The legend of Prester John had its beginnings in the 11th century. To Europeans at the time, the world was defined by their rivalry with the various Muslim states that had threatened Europe as early as the 8th century. Europeans were cut off from the rest of the world by the various Muslim dynasties, and the knowledge and awareness of the world to the south and east that had accompanied Macedonian and then Roman conquest had been lost to time. The acceptance that there could be a lost Christian kingdom full of riches and splendor reveals the limited understanding Europeans had of geography and geopolitics. The fact that Prester John's kingdom was placed at various times in locations as disparate as East Africa, India, and Central Asia suggests that any hint of a non-Muslim power was interpreted as a potential Christian ally. Europeans at the time were largely unaware that there were religions other than Christianity and Islam, and so tales of Buddhist or Hindu kingdoms fueled the myth of Prester John. The proliferation of this story reveals both the desperation felt by Europeans in the face of the Muslim onslaught and their general ignorance of the larger world. Question 6. Why was Europe largely spared from a full-on Mongol assault? The conquest of the Abbasid Empire, followed by the subjugation of the Russian boyars, meant that the Mongols were now free to raid and pillage from the Adriatic region in the south to Poland and the German states in the north. It also left the rest of Europe open to conquest, just as the kings and clergy of the western portions of Christendom were beginning to fear the worst. the Mongol forces disappeared. The death of the Khagan Ogedai in the distant Mongol capital at Karakorum forced the leader of the Khanate of the Golden Horde, the westernmost portion of the Mongol Empire, Batu, to withdraw in preparation for the struggle for succession. The campaign for the conquest of Europe was never resumed. Perhaps Batu was satisfied with the huge empire of the Golden Horde that he ruled from his splendid new capital at Sarai on the Volga River in what is today southern Russia. Ironically, the Mongols had essentially accomplished what Europeans had hoped for from Prester John. Eastern Orthodox states in Eastern Europe and Muslim states in Central Asia and the Middle East had been weakened by the Mongol onslaught. The Western European states, while still constantly engaged in internal warfare, nonetheless remained intact. The greater awareness of the world to the east that had resulted from the Mongol expansion spurred commerce and trade, resulting in wealthier European states better able to venture out into a world that would, in a matter of centuries, fall under the dominion of one or another European state. Question 7. What is the significance of the naming of the Yuan dynasty? Following the death of Genghis Khan and the election of his son Ogedai as Khagan, the Mongol advance into China, temporarily paused while the succession was being decided, resumed. Having conquered the Shi, Xia, and Jin empires, the Mongol commanders turned to what remained of the Song dynasty in South China. In the campaigns against the Song, the Mongol forces were directed by Kublai Khan. Kublai was one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan, and he would play a pivotal role in Chinese history for the next half-century. Having pushed the last of the Song resistance back into more remote regions of southern China, in 1260 Kublai assumed the title of Khagan, or Great Khan. A decade later, on the recommendation of his Chinese advisors, he changed the name of his Mongol regime to a Chinese language dynastic title, the Yuan. Kublai Khan, much more so than Genghis or Ogedai, embraced Chinese culture. Despite the historic conquests of the Mongols, they never had the desire to establish a cultural dominance over their conquered subjects. The Mongols were contemptuous of sedentary cultures, who they saw as unworthy of participating in Mongol traditions. This meant, in retrospect, that regional cultures survived and in many cases thrived under Mongol rule. That Kublai adopted a Chinese dynastic name, embraced Chinese culture, and relied upon Chinese advisors is evidence that, for all their ferocity and ruthlessness, the Mongol culture simply lacked the substance of that of their conquered subjects, and therein lies the true significance of the Mongols. Their military prowess allowed them to conquer and interconnect a vast territory, but their cultural input was minimal, leaving those cultures and the connections between them intact long after the Mongols were gone. Question 8. Why might the bubonic plague have affected nomadic peoples more severely than sedentary peoples? The wave of bubonic plague that swept through Eurasia in the 14th century, picking up the name Black Death along the way, originated in Central Asia. Its spread was probably due to the Mongols, either directly through their conquests or indirectly along the trade routes they now curated. The impact of the plague was most visible in sedentary societies, whose concentration of populations in typically unhygienic urban environments made them particularly susceptible to catastrophic depopulation. Its long-term effects, however, were felt more acutely by nomadic peoples. Nomadic population densities were quite low, a fact that might have protected them from contagion were it not for their complete reliance on livestock for their way of life. The fleas that infested the herds of goats, sheep, and horses that formed the core of the nomadic cultures and economies carried the plague, and so the potential benefit of low human population density was offset by concentrated animal populations. Despite the depopulation of most of Europe's major cities during the Black Death, the cities, buildings, institutions, commercial and artisanal capacity remained, so that even a much reduced population had the means to begin rebuilding. For a nomadic population lacking permanent settlements and, in many cases, written traditions, the people were the culture. Once nomadic people are diminished or gone, there is no surviving framework to rebuild around. Thus, the Black Death served as a major contributor to the decline of the Mongols and other nomadic peoples. Question 9. Why did the Mongol Empire collapse so quickly? What long-term effects would the Mongol conquests have on the policies of regional powers in the post-Mongol period? Historians debate why the Mongols yielded so quickly. Poor military decisions, overexpansion, disease, and exhaustion of military recruits all contributed, as did the determination of the conquered peoples to get rid of a deeply resented invader. The collapse of the Mongols, obviously, contributed its own set of issues to Eurasian history. Successful resistors, such as China and Russia, would have to decide what regional strategies to pursue to prevent invasions in the future. The results help explain the end of nomadic incursions, but they also strongly influenced Chinese and Russian history in the decades to come. More broadly, questions inevitably arose about whether the expanded interregional contacts fostered by the Mongols could, or should, be maintained through some other mechanism, a question that would affect European and Asian policies alike for centuries.